How's it going, guys? This is Ryoma, photographer based in Tokyo. So it's unfortunate to say that one of my most viewed videos on my channel is an L4 Bright 35mm film camera, which is really easy to use, and it's something that I realized over the course of making YouTube videos that the more artsy things you do, only the minority will watch, while the opposite is true. If you aim for the masses, if a lot of people understand what you're doing, a lot of people would watch that video. So if you want to succeed in YouTube channel, I mean, aim for the masses, not the minority as I do. So here comes the Kodak Ektar H35 half film camera, which is a long title, and probably you guys been waiting for it, and I've been waiting for a long time. Because I live in Japan, it takes a long time to get it shipped over from the United States to Japan. And I have to say that Kodak actually learned from their lessons compared to their previous generations of these types of like point and shoot type of like non-disposable cameras in a good way. And this is basically a half camera made by Kodak, and right out of this moment they currently sell, ouch, for film cameras and for different flavors. Actually, they have a black one, they have a sand color, brown, and a sage color, and I personally went with the sage one because due to the fact that it's a unique color and not many cameras make cameras in this sort of like sage type of color. So I just went ahead and purchased this one with my own hard-earned cash. And what is basically a half camera is, for your information and for my people who are watching my videos for educational purposes, a half camera is basically, you guys probably know, a 35mm film full frame camera has a dimension of 24mm by 36mm in width, while a half frame camera basically shoots half that dimension. So basically shoots 18mm by 24mm. So basically uses half of the full frame and basically slices it in half, and you basically get double the shots. And due to the fact that that horizontal 35mm frame is basically sliced in half, what you get is sort of like a vertical orientation film negative type of shot, and you basically get double the shots like I just said. So if you shoot with a 36 exposure film stock, you will get 72, while if you shoot with a 27 exposure film, you get 54. And also due to the fact that because it uses half that what I call surface area of a 35mm, instead of getting a horizontal sort of like color negatives, you basically, your shots will appear in the vertical orientations. And because it's shot on the vertical orientation, the viewfinder is also in the vertical orientation. So that's like something new to keep in mind when shooting with this camera. And as the title says, Kodak previously made a bunch of these what I call point and shoot types of non-disposable cameras, the M35 that I talked about a long time ago, and the M38, while Ilford has their Sprite series. And I have to admit, Kodak took this seriously and made some renovations, aka Kaizen in Japan, and improved from their predecessors on this particular camera. And one of the things that they improved is the aesthetics. Like, I dislike the M35 because it had this sort of like one color monotone type of color, pastelish color, and if you look at their like series of like variations, the color availabilities, I mean, it looks like a toy more like a toy camera and not for our series shooters. And because of that, I went with a gray version because it was subtle. It didn't. For this type of camera, they basically renovated it and made it better by making the back plate black, sandwiched by a sort of like a silver like exterior, and on the front side they made a sort of like a leather type of textile texture kind of aesthetics for this camera to make it more like, I guess, retro-ish, if that's the word. And back when I made my M35 video, I talked about being really flimsy, and I guess this is due to the fact that that camera is made out of plastic, and this time it's still made out of plastic, but you can tell by how it feels and how it sounds actually when you shake the camera that they actually, this is the M35, this is the Kodak Ektar H35 half camera. Well, that's basically the strap that's ringing around. They basically wielded the camera much better than the M35, so in terms of probably durability wise, it is probably going to last longer, far longer. So this goes into area of one of the areas they made some renovations, which is the battery compartment. The M35, you basically had to stick in the battery sideways, and because of that, the battery compartment, they basically had to use a different part for that, a black sort of like plastic, which aesthetically wise, it doesn't look good. However, on the H35, they basically made it so that the battery goes straight into the camera, so it takes less space. And when you look at the bottom plate of the camera, it looks much better and not too like cheap at all. So that's one of the things they basically innovated for this camera. And they also made the camera much more streamlined, flush, and they removed the grip from the M35. So by doing that, they were able to like shave off the overall what I call size of the camera compared to the M35 and M38 actually. So this is much more pocketable. It's much more smaller, and it's like similar to Fujifilm's like disposable camera, the Utsurundesu. And by doing that, it just looks much better than the M35 on all areas, 4 corners. Other things I need to mention is definitely the way you basically load your film into this camera. Typically, a typical like 35mm film camera, you basically stick in the film canister on the left side and stretch the film to the right side and basically wind towards the right. However, this is the complete opposite. You basically load your film in this H35 half camera on the right side, and you basically pull the film to the left side and wind it to the left. So what happens is that the winding button, lever, or what you would call it, is on the bottom left instead of the top right. And this is sort of like my biased opinion. I actually did not like having the what I call, after I take the shot, I wind it on the right side. I did not like that because it felt really unstable after you take the shot and you basically wind it. It's like this camera is like really hard to like hold because there's no more, they removed the grip. So by having it on the bottom left, after you take the shot, obviously this is like my way of doing, but after you take the shot, it naturally comes back to my left hand, and when I hold my left hand, I can basically wind it, and that's sort of like a natural thing for me to do, and I'm used to doing that because when I take a shot, I shoot it like, even if I shoot with the SLR Nikon F3, I shoot it like this, or if I hold, and my left hand's always on the bottom, holding the lens or maybe the body itself, and it feels natural to adjust my hand back and wind in this manner instead of having it on the top right. This is sort of like my biased opinion. I enjoy shooting with this camera because that winding is at the bottom, and I'm basically used to that kind of like, I guess, movement and style. I mean, this is sort of like a personal preference kind of thing. I enjoy it. Some people might hate this, winding it on the bottom left compared to bottom right. I mean, you have to deal with it. So that's like one of the things I noticed after shooting with this camera. And another area that I also need to point out is that they sort of like moved the flash button actually. In the M35 and I guess L4 too, there was a button on the left side where you basically slide the sort of like, there's like a small lever, and when you move it to the left, it basically goes into a flash mode, and the flash basically charges, and when you take the shot, it flashes. However, on the Kodak H35, they basically integrate it into this sort of like lens, which it looks really nice actually, and all you have to do is like swipe or twist this like aperture ring type of lens to the right actually, or to the left actually, and it goes into that flash mode, and when you take the shot, it basically charges and discharges and you basically can operate the flash. And this is really interesting because I like that sound compared to the M35's like sort of like flimsy lever. I mean, this isn't a pleasant sound ever, but this is much more pleasant, and I enjoy like using this switch. And because they were able to like move that, you know, instead of a lever into this sort of like aperture type of ring, this is much more, it's hard to like change, meaning that you won't accidentally like flick the, you know, the lever on the M35 H35 actually. So that's one of the innovations or improvements they made in this camera actually. I basically tested this camera out around Shakujii Koen, aka Tokyo Metropolitan Shakujiii Park, which is like one stop away from Ikebukuro Station on the Seibu Ikebukuro Line if you ride the express actually. And it's sort of like a really countryside-ish type of park, which there's a large like pond, and I thought it would be a great idea to like shoot with this camera and yeah, have a great time with it. And at the same time I will like stick in some photos for you guys for your information. So yeah, after shooting with this camera, there were a couple of things I've noticed that was really unique about this camera compared to a typical 35, which I need to like mention on my channel. So one is, like I said, it shoots 2 frames and on a single 35mm what you call frame. But I completely forgot that within those 2 frames, there's sort of like a black border within those 2 frames. So it's sort of, and I realized later that if you like, let's say shoot a dark environment and after that you shoot a bright environment, it's actually going to take 2 times more time to process that photo compared to shooting with just one typical like 35mm film, because you basically need to sort of like select that area and do some tinkering around with exposures in post actually. So I just realized afterwards that it actually takes double the time. Although you get double the exposure and you're basically saving money up front, you basically need to allocate more time when processing those photos, because there's like 72 photos actually to process instead of a typical 36. So that kind of hit me hard actually when I've finally got my like film negatives and started scanning them. And at the same time, the scanning process, it's doubled because you basically have to scan everything. I mean, there's like 2 ways of scanning it. You can basically scan 2 exposures on that 35 all at once, or you can scan one by one, which takes forever and which I really did not want to do. So I basically scanned the whole 2 frames as a one, like sort of like negative as a 35mm, and basically process from there. And like I said, it takes much more time because you had to focus on one half frame, and then after you finish like editing on that one frame, you had to go to the next frame, and depending on what you shoot, it might be overexposed or it might be underexposed. So was actually much harder for me to edit compared to like shooting with a 35mm. And because this camera shoots at a fixed like setting of 1/125 of a second at f8, f11 somewhere along that line, the film stock that you will choose will have your final, like the final results will change dramatically. I shot with a Fujicolor 100, and I think I said it in my Ultra video and my M35 video that I would highly suggest shooting with a higher speed film stock like a Color Plus 200, Ultra Max 400, 200, 400 is the better bet when shooting with this camera, because if you shoot with a 100 ISO film stock, like if you look at the photos that I shot, there were like some shots that were like really dark and you can't understand what I shot. But if you shoot with like an ISO 400 film stock, you will know what you will be shooting, even if you shoot in darker environments. And at the same time, if you overexpose, you can basically retrieve those highlights, details in post. So I highly suggest shooting with an ISO of 400 film stock, or maybe 200 might work if you're shooting in a bright environment. So that's like another thing that I realized after shooting with this camera. It's like another area that kind of disturbed me in a bad manner actually was that when you finish shooting with a film camera, you always have to wind it back to the canister. This camera in particular, I don't know what Kodak did, they messed this area up so badly. Like the previous M35, I didn't have that much issues like winding it back to the film canister due to the fact that the what you call the winding lever on this was relatively adequate in terms of size. But when I guess because they sort of like shrunk the size of this camera, the winding lever on this camera, I don't know if Kodak BS this area, but it's like super tiny. And I'm a Japanese guy, I have small fingers. I mean, I know it's gonna disturb a lot of people, but I mean, I had issues winding the film back onto that canister, and you guys know you had to do this, motion, you had to get into the groove and do it. But this was completely harder to like wind into the canister compared to the M35. I don't know why Kodak did this. They made it this sort of lever so tiny that, I mean, my fingers hurt. I mean, it hurts like so much. I don't know, like I was like dissing Kodak when I was like trying to like wind back that 36 exposure, 72 exposures back into the canister. But I'm a Japanese guy, I have small fingers. If you're a foreigner, you guys probably have more, you guys have a larger hand than I do, so you guys will probably know what I'm going to be talking about, because it is really hard to grasp this lever. And when I compare the size of this lever with the M35, the lever itself, the length of the lever hasn't changed, but what changed was this sort of like, can you guys see it? There's this sort of like dent or area that pokes out basically, and this sort of like length is like 0.4 centimeters or so, while the M35 is 0.5 probably in terms of like, so they basically sort of like shaved off the sort of like the distance of this area that's poking out, and because of that it's harder to grasp, harder to like sort of like pick out and wind it to your film after you finish shooting it. And a lot of people will hate this sort of like camera due to that fact it's like hard to like wind your film into the canister. And I don't know if Kodak's gonna fix this problem after in the next iterations of this camera. It's just BS actually, sorry Kodak. I mean, that's like the one area they kind of failed on this camera, and I had to like make a area for that to sort of warn my viewers that even if you purchase this camera, you will have a hard time winding it back onto the like film. So that because there's like 2 photos in 1 frame, I guess the best way of shooting this camera is shooting something wide like a landscape or something, and and for the second actually shot, it might be a good idea to shoot something close nearby. And if you like shoot 2 landscapes in similar sort of like distance, it's not that appealing, it's not engaging for the sort of like the viewers. And I realized that if you shoot something close nearby in a second shot, if it's in the landscape, sort of like infinity type of like distance, it kind of pulls the sort of like viewers into your image, or like sort of like what you're trying to like shoot, and it makes a sort of photo much more engaging and much more pleasing for the audience. So that's another thing I realized after shooting with this camera, and I should have done that more. I kept shooting like landscapes over and over again, and my photos don't look that good. So unfortunately, and I should have said this in the first part of the video, because this is a half frame, it basically uses a half of the surface area of the 35mm. All your photos will be, instead of a horizontal orientation, it will go into the vertical orientation because it uses 18 by 24mm dimension. And because of that, the viewfinder itself will be in the vertical orientation. There's basically just like a sort of like a cover that basically covers the left side and the right side. So when you look in the viewfinder, it will always look in the vertical orientation. So people might hate shooting in the vertical orientations, and I typically love to shoot in the horizontal orientation. However, because this is a half frame, everything's in vertical orientation, so I had to compose it that way. And this might sort of turn down on some people who would love to shoot in not vertical, but horizontal orientation. But this is also something I realized, that if you combine a vertical orientation and a horizontal orientation, the photos will look not that pleasing in my eyes, and I should have shot them just in vertical throughout the shoot because it looks much more pleasing. And if you ever shoot in horizontal orientations with this camera, you will have a harder time editing those photos in post, because you have to basically crop that photo, put it into horizontal, and save it, and add brightness, contrast, saturations, etc., etc. And it takes much more time to process instead of just shooting with a 36mm and just shooting vertical or horizontal. So this is like solely for vertical orientation shooting, not for horizontal shooting, so keep that in mind. So that's basically it. So hopefully I covered everything in this video, so I might have missed something, but hopefully I kind of gave you guys a sort of like an indication or idea of what this camera can do, cannot do. So hope you guys enjoy this video. If you have any questions, and at the same time, this camera costs roughly $50 if I'm right, so it might be expensive for some, might be cheaper for some, but if you think about how much expensive the disposable cameras have become in Japan, disposable camera like the Fujifilm's Utsurun disc costs roughly 1,500 yen to 2,000 yen. Right now it costs like $15 or $16, somewhere around that range. And this is, like I said, costs $50. So if you use like 3 or 4 disposable cameras within a year or so, you can basically make your money back by just shooting with this camera and just buying, well, the film stock's getting more expensive, so in order to retrieve that cost, you might need to shoot like 5 or 6 rolls or so. But still, when you think about like purchasing a disposable camera and versus purchasing something like this is much more cheaper if you shoot a lot within that format. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy this video, and yeah, if you have any questions regarding this camera, please leave it in the comments below. I'm happy to reply. And yeah, and I'm planning on to sort of rent this to a friend who's like really interested in shooting with this camera. So yeah, I'm curious of what she is gonna say. So yeah, we'll see you next time. Peace out.